What's up, wizards? Welcome back to Across the Horizon, a collaborative effort between Christopher Warnock of Renaissance Astrology and Michael Beeson of Hacking Fate. I'm Michael Beeson, and with me is Christopher Warnock. Today, we will be covering Aphorism 17.
It says 17, give no judgment as to the future life of an aged person until the number of years he may live have been reckoned.
I have, when thou art to give judgment concerning the length of an old man's life, do not give judgment before thou hast considered how long he may live according to his nativity, i.e., by considering the Hylic, the al-Khazin, and the killing directions.
So I think that's the best one. Coley says, being demanded the length of an old man's life, be not rash to give your judgment before you have considered or measured according to the nativity, how long he may live according to nature. Like I said, it reminds me of there's this idea that if you're looking at a natal chart of a young child, or of a newborn, that before you even go ahead and do the entire reading, you want to make sure that's even going to live at all, which is interesting. And there's a bunch of different natal techniques in terms of that. And again, we get into this, and I'm sure someone's going to come along and say, oh, you guys aren't pronouncing it correctly. But it's Hylic, I think it's al-Khazin. When you're talking about the natal chart, there are, in traditional sources, a whole bunch of different techniques in terms of determining the length of life. And so these will use a variety of different sort of points, and including, for example, the Hylic, which I end up using more like there's a pars Hylic that comes up occasionally, but it's also used in the in calculating the names of like guardian angel. So I actually use it for that. They talk about the hyligal places. Those are the sun, the moon, the ascendant, the part of fortune, and then the prenatal syzygy, which is just basically the new moon or full moon that's previous to the birth. And my recollection is that you choose the strongest of those as the Hylic. I don't know. I'd have to go through it. I mean, the problem with this calculation is that there's only about 10 different ways of doing it. And then, when you do it, it's sort of like, doesn't necessarily that accurate. I think that the best sort of compromise I've heard about this or way of dealing with this is say, well, there's a crisis point at this, it'll point where you have, difficult health problems or something to deal with, or an accident or something like that. This is a difficult period. And whether or not you're going to die precisely at that point. It's one of those situations where you have a lot of people looking at Hitler's chart or Einstein's chart kind of situations and going, oh, look, see, this works perfectly, when they already know the outcome. I haven't seen too many people that have been able to do accurate predictions of death. And the thing I'd say about that too is that I have a similar problem with Horary. Even though Horary is much more accurate, I don't have a really good record of death predictions. I had an interesting one. A friend of mine got sick, and immediately upon hearing it, it was sort of like an event chart, sort of a asked Horary. I immediately was like, I wonder, if he's going to die. I wonder if he's going to be okay, basically. And so that was an interesting chart because my recollection was it was something to the effect of the ruler of the ascendant was combust in the 8th house, and was then making this approaching aspect with Mars or something like that within like 8 degrees, and he died within like 8 months. I mean, it was amazing. It had the classic signs of death, and it also even had accurate timing indications. It was really quite amazing. However, I've had subsequent death questions where people are like, which I thought were legitimate. For example, someone had a relative that had terminal cancer or something. Would they survive the year? Things like that. And I haven't been able to be that accurate with them. Partly it's because of timing problems. I mean, will I die? Obviously the answer is yes. So will I die within the next year? Then you've got some timing problems to come up with. I think the other question about it that would come up with, and modern astrologers will sometimes raise this, but I think it comes up in general, is even ethical. So it's like, oh, you shouldn't tell people these things. It'll freak them out. Now, obviously, when I do a natal reading, I have manner of death, not timing, but how you're going to die. And I only do that if people specifically ask me to do that. I don't just go up to people and be, oh, by the way, you're going to die of a car accident. I don't think it's unethical to predict death if the person is serious, if they're asking for themselves, if they have a legitimate reason for it. The problem that I have is that I'm just not very accurate with it, even with a horary. And natal, I just have a personal skepticism about natal timing techniques. Certainly, I don't question that they might work. I just have never been able to get them to work that accurate for myself in terms of prediction. So that's what I would say about that. It's an interesting, it would make sense that you don't want to start doing a bunch of predictions about someone if they're going to die anyway. But the question in my mind, as far as this aphorism, would be whether it's even possible to accurately predict someone's death, death date. I would have to say it's undecided at this point. I mean, it'd be nice to see somebody come along and do 50 predictions and get 30 of them right or something like that, or, get within a certain time period. Generally, like I said, what people are doing is looking at Hitler's chart and not really doing prediction at all.
I kind of wonder about the context of this advice. I mean, what does it mean by an old man? Is this somebody saying, hey, if somebody looks like they might be on death's doorstep, maybe don't do a reading, which is the same, that would be the other side. Whereas we have one side being the infant, the other side being the person that legitimately looks like they're about to die, and seeing if it works there. I mean, I don't think this is, hey, somebody who's beyond middle age, who's definitely in the old range, but doesn't have any other concerns and seems healthy. I don't see why you would follow this particular advice. Now, maybe that's just because I live now.
Well, I was going to say, that's really the infant mortality rate was so much higher. Now, one of the things that's a little misleading is that people say, well, the life expectancy was 30 years. It's like, it doesn't mean you go to 30 years and just die. What that means is there's so many children dying and so many people dying along the way, but people certainly did live to a ripe old age. So, I think that's one of those misleading, it's sort of like, everyone thought the earth was flat kind of thing. It's like, no, I mean, there's a lot of, we live in the best time of all, which is clearly not true. It depends on what you're into. But I think that, certainly, I think that I think it's basically exactly as you're saying, it's the flip side. It's like, don't waste your time on somebody who's going to be dying anyway. I think is kind of what this aphorism is pointing at. And as you said, that's nowadays, certainly that's not going to be very many situations where you can, and I wouldn't do it. And like I said, how accurate can we be in terms of the prediction? So it's an interesting concept, but as a practical matter, I wonder whether it's really possible to implement this. And certainly to say to somebody, hey, I'm not going to do a reading for you because I think you're going to die anyway. I don't know. I mean, is that really, I mean, I already looked at your chart and you're going to die in 6 months, so forget about it. I mean, I wouldn't want to give someone that information unasked for. That would be a pretty rough thing to do to somebody, particularly if you're wrong or if you're right. I mean, either way, it's problematic.
No, I don't see it as super, super useful. I mean, again, there's the whole context. What is this person asking about or trying to accomplish? So there's a lot of, is that really that useful? And then we get to the whole theory that horary conditions were escape hatches for the astrologer. I don't really know if this is kind of that as well. Not that I actually think that, because you can get very, very useful information by looking at those conditions that need to be met for a horary to be radical. So it's just
yeah. I don't even get to the radicality. Yeah. I mean, in my experience, radicality is used by people that don't like the result of the outcome of the horary. So it's sort of like, well, that's not radical, which they wouldn't care about if they got the answer they wanted. But if they don't like the answer, they're like, oh, well, that's a bad chart. So, I mean, I haven't had that so much recently, but I have a whole page on my website about radicality, and that's helpful for people. Like, whoa, and I'm like, here, take a look at the page. So it's like, anytime people ask the question a bunch of times, I think it's useful to do that. But I don't think this really is talking about radicality. I think this really is, I think it's one of those things where it's like, if it was as a concept, right? Yeah, that makes sense, just as a sort of like theoretical thing to toss out there. But as a professional astrologer, just like we were saying, I don't think this is that useful because, I see it would be, the implementation of it is so difficult. And then you don't want to get that wrong. And so I think you would probably just go ahead and do the reading regardless. Even if you looked at the chart and thought, oh my God, the person's going to drop dead. I think you'd probably just go ahead and do the chart anyway, just out of an abundance of caution. Maybe I don't have it right, or maybe the person doesn't want to hear that. And certainly nowadays, it's interesting. There's a cultural change. I think nowadays that people are really, really nervous about any kind of death stuff. And I think that's part of the, it's unethical to tell people that. Whereas, I think that you know, in Lily's time in the 16th century or 17th century, I think death was much more omnipresent for people, and it wasn't segregated into hospitals, and, you know, there was a lot more awareness of it, and they had a lot more illness and things that you could die from. So I think it was something that, you know, I don't think people were any more happy about it, but I think people were more aware of the possibility of it and more open to it in a way. But nowadays, you just never want to say that to anybody. And like I said, there's even a question whether it's unethical if someone comes to you and says, "Oh, is it, you know, can I do it or not?" People debate that. I think it's not a problem, but there's certainly modern astrologers out there that say that you shouldn't do it at all.
The other thing that I think is interesting about this one is with the Partridge translation itself, throwing in the examples of the techniques that you need to consider.
I wonder if that was in the original.
Kind of cute. Yeah.
I have a feeling that probably wasn't in the original, but it really helps us in terms of understanding what the heck they're talking about to throw that in. They're like, oh yeah, you know, highly al-Khazin. Yeah, that's what that is. So that's very useful. And that is the standard length of life technique. You know, it's classic. And I think goes back to Hellenistic astrology or not. It's certainly in all, you know, all the traditional natal, you know, Bonatti and those guys are, and our Gadbury and those guys are all using that and talking about it and familiar with it as a basic technique, though they all have their different take on it. You know, the methodology that you use is different depending on each author. There's not unanimity in terms of how to figure it out. So good. Well, good. Well, that was interesting.
Yeah,
we got a lot out of that one, I think.